I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode 137 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality crime-related fiction. And this week, I'm answering questions about California's Alcoholic Beverage Control Agency, who investigates murders involving the military, and the surprising limitation on tribal police law enforcement powers. This week's first question comes from Christopher Kratchman, who asks, "This is a California ABC question. How common is it when there is a bar fight or other acts of violence at a bar or other liquor establishment, the special agents with the Alcoholic Beverage Control will respond with the police? Would they wait for your reports on the incident and then respond? My detective is investigating a robbery at a bar. Thank you." Thanks for the question, Christopher. Agents for the California Alcoholic Beverage Control typically work targeted enforcement and don't typically respond to in-progress calls with police officers. California ABC usually gets involved once we, as local police, report recurring incidents to the ABC about a particular establishment. This could be us catching a series of juveniles buying beer from a particular gas station, or it could be a string of violence stemming from the same bar. The key here is that it's a pattern of behavior on the part of a licensed liquor establishment. Now, liquor laws vary greatly across the United States, and in California, ABC is both the lead regulatory and enforcement agency for alcohol-related crimes. There are two basic alcohol licenses for a business, either on sale or off sale. On sale is for consumption of alcoholic beverages on site, like a bar or a restaurant where you consume the drink on the property. And then off sale is where you take the beverage off of the property to consume it, like a grocery store or a liquor store. On-sale establishments will have a very specific floor plan or boundary that's approved by the ABC as part of that establishment's license. So this is why you may be prohibited from walking out the front door with a drink, but not the back door, like into a beer garden behind a bar, that kind of thing. One of the biggest changes I've seen in years was during the COVID pandemic. ABC allowed restaurants that were barred from indoor dining at the time to do cocktails to go. This was unheard of because on-sale licenses were essentially allowed to operate as off-sale licenses during the COVID pandemic. About the only businesses that I've seen that are allowed to do both on-sale and off-sale under the same roof are typically breweries and wineries where they're selling their own beer or wine. California also bifurcates their licenses between beer and wine and general. And general means beer, wine, and hard alcohol. The beer and wine licenses are much more affordable to obtain for a business. Now, I'm oversimplifying a lot of this. In reality, the ABC has 83 different types of alcohol license. So as a peace officer, like a police officer, I'm authorized to carry out ABC inspections of any ABC licensee, which means I can inspect any bar, restaurant, or store with a liquor license without a search warrant, as long as I'm looking for ABC-related violations, or technically business and professions code violations relating to alcohol. Now, because we in local law enforcement have this authority throughout the state, it also means we are barred from having our own ABC license. So I cannot be a cop and an ABC licensee at the same time. So I'll have to retire before buying a bar. In addition to investigating problem locations for alcohol license violations, the ABC will also conduct decoy operations throughout the state. These are ops where a minor, meaning someone under the age of 21, attempts to buy alcohol directly from a licensed establishment. In all of these situations, if a cashier asks for the ID of the decoy purchaser, the minor decoy gives a real underage ID. So this is not some kind of trickery on the ABC's part. The real question is whether the employees of the licensed establishment are ensuring minors are not buying alcohol. And lastly, I should mention that California's ABC agents are fully sworn peace officers employed by the state, so they can make arrests for state crimes just like any other police officer in California. They primarily work in plainclothes, And in addition to the types of investigations we already talked about, ABC agents also investigate applications for licenses to sell alcoholic beverages and report on the moral character and fitness of applicants and the suitability of premises where sales are to be conducted. Can you tell I just took that off their website? So in other words, they do background checks on anyone applying for a liquor license. Thanks for the question, Chris. Our next question comes from Nathan Lamberson, who just launched his debut thriller, Coming Home to Terror, which I will link to in the show notes. So Nathan has this question. What government agency investigates when a soldier dies under suspicious circumstances overseas? First of all, Nathan, congratulations on launching your debut thriller. Now, to answer your question, it really depends on which branch of the armed forces that service member belongs. Technically, a quote-unquote soldier, as you mentioned in your question, would be an enlisted member of the U.S. Army. So let's start there. If an Army soldier were killed overseas with some sort of suspicious circumstance at play, Army CID, or Criminal Investigations Division, would be the lead agency. But I would absolutely expect the FBI to be heavily involved just in terms of bringing resources, be it worldwide boots on the ground, wherever the leads in the case stretch to, or laboratory testing, or expertise, or whatever they needed. So I hope this helps for any future stories you might be considering for the FBI special agent protagonist you have in your debut novel. In fact, I will link to an open and unsolved murder of a real Army paratrooper that happened in 2020. Specialist Enrique Roman Martinez, originally of Chino, California, but based in Fort Bragg, was found murdered after going on a camping trip to the Outer Banks in North Carolina. As of this year, which is 2023, if you happen to listen to this episode in the future, but as of 2023, the case remains an unsolved Army CID investigation. But you'll see from the 2020 story that the FBI was heavily involved in the investigation. At the very least, check out the links that I will include in the show notes to see if you might be able to help solve this murder, the murder and dismemberment of Specialist Enrique Roman Martinez. So I'll link to the 2020 and 2023 news articles in the show notes, which you can find at writersdetective.com/137. If you read the Nelson DeMille book, The General's Daughter, or happen to catch the movie of the same title starring John Travolta, the protagonist in that was Warrant Officer Paul Brenner, who was an investigator with Army CID. The popular TV show NCIS will likely make many of you aware that we have a Naval Criminal Investigative Service that handles criminal investigations within the U.S. Navy and the United States Marine Corps. To my knowledge, unlike Army CID, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service is staffed totally with civilian 1811 criminal investigators, special agents, like most federal investigative agencies. So being a special agent with NCIS means you are not in the military per se. You're a civilian 1811 special agent, just like an FBI agent or Secret Service agent, that kind of thing. The Coast Guard has its own CGIS, or Coast Guard Investigative Service, which is made up of 1811 civilian special agents, just like NCIS. But unlike NCIS, they also have active Coast Guard officers, Coast Guard warrant officers, and Coast Guard enlisted personnel. And they also have investigators that are members of the Coast Guard Reserve. And finally, the Office of Special Investigations, or OSI, is the criminal investigative agency for the U.S. Air Force and now the United States Space Force. Whether these agencies are staffed with civilian 1811 special agents or a mix of 1811s and military members, their missions are all very similar, and they include felony investigations, including murder, involving the Uniform Code of Military Justice, military members, or military bases around the world. I will provide links to all of the criminal investigation agencies for all of the U.S. military branches in the show notes if you'd like to learn more. This week's third question comes from Michael Scott. Hi, longtime listener, first-time caller. I'm working on a story where a displaced officer, in other words, he left a big city police force and moved to a rural town, finds himself investigating the disappearance of an Indigenous woman. I know policing on a reservation is fraught with issues, but could you provide some insight into what is and isn't allowed by the local PD versus tribal police? Thanks. Thanks for the question, Michael. Historically, there's been no shortage of animosity between local police departments or sheriff's offices and their neighboring tribal police departments. Racial tensions, questionable hiring standards, federal versus local laws, the tribal sovereignty, good old-fashioned egocentrism, they all played significant roles in how tribal police were historically viewed by other law enforcement agencies. Some of that still exists to this day. I remember one story where an officer with one agency arrested a tribal officer for impersonating a peace officer because that tribal officer was driving code 3, which is lights and siren, on a county road to get from one part of a reservation to another. I can't even imagine that happening, but that's that's reality. You'd think that in today's day and age that being a tribal police officer would be like working for any other police department. But putting all the animosity stuff and historical stuff aside, well, it is historical, but there is one giant difference. Honestly, I wasn't even aware of this until researching your question, Michael, and that giant difference is a 1978 U.S. Supreme Court case called Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian Tribe, 435 U.S. 191, for those of you wanting to look it up for the court case. So in the Oliphant case, the U.S. Supreme Court removed tribal police criminal jurisdiction over non-Native Americans. In other words, the tribal police could no longer arrest non-Native Americans. Thankfully, 2 years ago, in United States v. Cooley, which is 593 U.S. from 2021, there is no page citation for it yet, as far as looking it up in the legal books. So United States v. Cooley, 593 U.S. blank for the year 2021. The U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that a tribal police officer has authority to detain temporarily and to search a non-Native American traveling on a public right-of-way running through a reservation for potential violations of state or federal law. Sounds pretty logical, right? But for those of you who have been members of the Bureau for a while, think back to what I've said about state versus federal laws and how they differ, bearing in mind that tribal lands are considered sovereign governments. Now think about the definition of a detention versus an arrest. It creates quite a problem for a tribal police officer, but it may make for a really interesting cat and mouse game between protagonist and antagonist in a story. So here's the problem with US v. Cooley. It creates a situation where a tribal police officer can stop and investigate a non-Native American, but it does not grant the tribal police officer the authority to arrest a non-Native American. The tribal police officer must rely on either a neighboring agency like the sheriff's office or police department to actually make the arrest. But in many areas of the country where that animosity still runs high between police agencies, you might have a situation where the tribal police officer has enough probable cause to arrest someone, but has to let them go because the neighboring agency refuses or is unable to respond. So I'll link to the Oliphant and the US v. Cooley cases in the show notes as well. And I'll also include an interesting NPR article on the topic as well. But for your story, Michael, if your protagonist discovers the Native American woman that is missing was in fact kidnapped by a non-Native, your protagonist is going to need a partner with another agency to bring that suspect to justice. Thank you so much for the question, Michael. So what are your questions? Send them to me no matter how small the question by going to writersdetective.com/ask. I'd also like to thank my Patreon patrons for sponsoring this episode, especially my Gold Shield patrons, Deborah Dunbar from deborahdunbar.com, Cece Jameson from ccjameson.com, Larry Darter, Natalie Borelli, Craig Kingsman of craigkingsman.com, Marco Carocari of marcocarocari.com, Rob Kearns of knightsfallpress.com, Robert Mendenhall of robertjmendenhall.com, and Kaylee for their support, along with my Silver Cufflink and Coffee Club patrons. You can find links to all of the patrons supporting this episode in the show notes at writersdetective.com/137. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week and write well.